What's up, everybody? With conference tournaments underway and Selection Sunday being less than a week away, we are going to be predicting the winner for every conference tournament. Let's jump into it. First up, we got the Big 12, and in our first round matchup, we have the number 13 seeded Cincinnati Bearcats taking on the number 12 seed Oklahoma State. In this matchup, I got to give it to Cincinnati. They were a projected tournament team this year, but have had a really unfortunate season. But I don't think the Cowboys are going to have enough to beat the Bearcats, so give me Cincinnati moving on to the second round. Then we have Colorado coming in at the last seed, number 16, versus TCU. TCU played a tough game against Baylor recently, and I don't think Colorado's going to give them too many issues, so give me TCU moving on. Then we have Arizona State versus K-State. K-State was one of the hottest teams in the country at the beginning of the calendar year, so I think the Wildcats are able to get past Arizona State and move on to the second round against Baylor. Then we have Utah versus UCF. Utah has made some recent upsets and has been playing well as of late. I think they're going to get past UCF and make it to the next day. Then in our second round, we see Cincinnati taking on Iowa State, and Iowa State is just going to be way too much. They're solid at every position. Also, they have one of the best defenses in the nation, and that offense has been getting going as of late since everybody's been back from injury. So I like the Cyclones to advance. Then we have TCU versus West Virginia. West Virginia, as of right now, is a projected tournament team, but they are on the bubble. I think they're going to be fighting for their lives to get into the tournament, so I think they advance to the next one. Then K-State versus Baylor, and K-State has to win this conference tournament in order to make it to the NCAA tournament. Baylor, on the other hand, I think they're safely in, and they're pretty banged up. Lost Josh Oshinawa earlier this season, and Langston Love and Jeremy Roach have been dealing with injuries as well. But I think K-State is going to move on and advance past Baylor to face Texas Tech in the third round. Then in our last matchup of the second round, we see Utah versus Kansas, and Kansas has been playing better as of late, beat Arizona in their last regular season matchup, was close against Houston on the road. I'm going to pick the Jayhawks to move on and advance and play Arizona in the third round. So our first game of the quarterfinals features Iowa State versus BYU. BYU beat Iowa State on the road in Ames earlier this season, but I think Iowa State gets them back in this one. Give me Iowa State advancing to the semifinals. Then we see West Virginia playing Houston, and although West Virginia is on that bubble and is playing extremely hard, really Javon Small is their only main player, and I think he would have to have a big game in order to get past Houston, so I'm going to be picking the Cougars to advance to the semifinals. Then we see K-State making a run and playing against Texas Tech in the quarterfinals, but I think this is where they get cut short and they're not able to win the Big 12 championship. Texas Tech has been playing like one of the best teams in the nation as of late, and I really like the Red Raiders in the upcoming NCAA tournament, so I'm going to be picking them to advance in the Big 12. Then lastly, we see a rematch of Kansas versus Arizona from the last game of the regular season for the two teams, and I'm actually going to be picking Kansas to get the better of them again and have Kansas advance to the semifinals. In the first game of the semifinals, we see Iowa State taking on Houston. These are two of the top three teams in the Big 12 in terms of how far they can advance in the NCAA tournament, in my opinion, so I think this would be a really close matchup, but I'm actually going to have Iowa State beating the number 1 seed Houston Cougars to advance to the championship game in the upset. And then we see Texas Tech taking on Kansas, and Kansas just doesn't have enough to get past Texas Tech, in my opinion. I think JT Toppin and his crew is going to be able to get the win and move on to the finals. So in our final matchup, we see Iowa State taking on Texas Tech. And I think this is going to be a really close game, but I'm going to give Iowa State the win and become Big 12 champs and maybe get a seed line bump coming into the NCAA tournament. All right, our next conference is the Big East, where we see St. John's as the number 1 overall seed to no one's surprise. But in our first round, our first matchups between Butler and Providence, I'm actually going to be picking Butler as the upset in this one. I think it'd be a really close game, but I trust what Butler's doing a little bit more. So give me the Bulldogs to advance to the quarterfinals. Then we see DePaul versus Georgetown. Georgetown without a stud freshman from a season-ending injury. I think it might be a little difficult to get past DePaul, but I'm still going to be picking the Hoyas to move on to the quarterfinals. Then we have Seton Hall versus Villanova. Villanova has actually had some pretty big upsets in the Big East this year. I think they're able to get past Seton Hall and make it to the quarterfinals. So our first matchup in the quarterfinals of the Big East tournament features Butler versus St. John's, and St. John's has been playing great as of late. They're 18-2 in conference, 27-4 overall, and the Butler Bulldogs will not be another one of their losses. Give me St. John's to advance to the semifinals. Then we see Marquette versus Xavier. Xavier coming on hot as of late, really making a push to make it into the NCAA tournament, with Marquette falling to St. John's in their last regular season game. I think Xavier really needs to win this game in order to solidify their spot in the NCAA tournament, so I'm going to be picking the Musketeers to win and advance to the semifinals against St. John's. Then we see Georgetown taking on Creighton. Creighton coming in as the number 2 seed in the Big East tournament. Very impressive from Greg McDermott's squad, especially who suffered an injury early on to Pop Isaacs. I'm going to be picking Creighton to advance. Just had a great season overall and trust them a bit more than I do Georgetown. And then UConn versus Villanova. I think this will be a really good matchup, but Danny Hurley is on a mission right now with this UConn team, and I think Liam McNeely is going to be a key piece and a key part of what they're doing in March, so I like UConn advancing to the semifinals. Then in our first semifinal matchup, we see St. John's versus Xavier. I think Xavier are going to be playing their hearts out, but St. John's is just too much. Kadari Richmond, RJ Lewis, and Zuby Ejiofor have been great as of late, and I trust what they can do at the end of games more than I do anyone on Xavier. And then we see Creighton taking on UConn. I'm actually going to be picking Danny Hurley and the UConn Huskies to advance to the Big East title. I think he's out for revenge right now when it comes to the narrative of UConn this season, being not as good as obviously the past 2 seasons. And I really like what Danny Hurley and the team have been doing as of late, so I'm going to be picking them to advance to the finals. So in our final matchup, we see Rick Pitino and St. John's taking on Danny Hurley and the UConn Huskies. And I'm still going to be picking Rick Pitino and St. John's. I know it's chalk, but they've had an incredible season, have not gotten blown out in any of their 4 losses, and I think they would win and become the Big East champions. Our next conference is the ACC, which has been dominated by Duke, but don't forget about Louisville and Clemson, which were 2 teams that were just 1 game back of Duke in the standings. But in our first round matchup, we see Notre Dame taking on Pitt at the 12-13 game. I'm going to be giving the edge to Pitt. I like them just a little more than Notre Dame, so I have them advancing to the second round. Then we see Virginia Tech taking on Cal. I'm going to stay with the better team in this one, so give me Virginia Tech. Then we see Florida State taking on Syracuse. Florida State trying to make a push and play for their coach Leonard Hamilton, who will be retiring at the end of this season, so I'm going to give Florida State the win to make it on to the second round against SMU. Then in our first matchup of the second round, we see Georgia Tech taking on Virginia. I'm going to be picking Georgia Tech in this one, specifically because this is a team that beat Clemson, which is playing like one of the best teams in the nation right now, so I'm picking Georgia Tech to the quarterfinals. Then we have Pitt taking on UNC. UNC playing Duke tough in the first half in their last regular season game of the ACC. So I like what North Carolina is doing, and I'm going to be picking them over Pitt to advance to the quarterfinals against Wake Forest. Then we have Virginia Tech versus Stanford. Give me Stanford in this one. I think it'd be a close game, but I like the Cardinals just a little more. And then SMU versus Florida State. I'm going to be picking Florida State to advance against SMU in this one, actually, getting Leonard Hamilton to the quarterfinals against Clemson. Then our first matchup of the quarterfinals, we see Duke taking on Georgia Tech, and this isn't even going to be a close one. Duke absolutely dominating the ACC, 19-1, and their only loss coming to Clemson, and a close one on the road. Give me the Duke Blue Devils to beat Georgia Tech. Then Wake Forest versus North Carolina. Hunter Salas at Wake Forest is a really good player, one of the best players in all of the ACC, but North Carolina has been showing something as of late. Even with that big loss to Duke at the end, I still think they're the better team, so give me the Tar Heels to advance to the semifinals for a rematch against Duke. Then we see Louisville taking on Stanford, and I think Pat Kelsey and the Louisville Cardinals are one of the best stories in all of college basketball this year, so I'm going to pick them to advance to the semifinals. Well, they'll be taking on Clemson, as Clemson is going to end Leonard Hamilton's career at Florida State, and the Tigers are going to be moving on to the semifinals of the ACC tournament. So in the semifinals, we see Duke taking on UNC and Louisville taking on Clemson. I think Duke is going to get the Tar Heels again. I just can't pick against this team right now when it comes to the way that they're playing, so give me Duke moving on to the championship. And then we see Louisville taking on the Clemson Tigers. Both teams have had really good seasons. Louisville currently ranked 13th in the AP poll, Clemson at 10th. Clemson 26-5 on the year, Louisville 25-6 on the year, and both 18-2 in the ACC. I think this would be a really close game, but I'm going to trust the experience that I see from the Clemson Tigers. Ian Shefflin, Chase Hunter are amazing. Victor Locken down low, 7-foot center. Really just have a lot of good pieces that play extremely well together, so I like Clemson to advance to the championship. well, they'll be taking on Duke. And in this matchup, I think Duke comes back and beats Clemson and avenges their loss from earlier this season and becomes ACC champions. The next conference we're covering is the SEC, the best conference in all of college basketball this season. And in our first matchup, we see Arkansas taking on South Carolina. Arkansas taking that ugly loss to South Carolina earlier this year, losing by 19 on the road. I think Coach Cal and the team really need this win just to solidify their spot in the NCAA tournament. So give me the Arkansas Razorbacks to move on past South Carolina and avenge that loss from earlier this season. Then we see Texas taking on Vanderbilt, a Vanderbilt team that's been a pretty big surprise. Mark Byington in his first season with the Commodores has been absolutely incredible, but I think I'm going to trust Trey Johnson and Texas to move on. Rodney Terry really needs this win. He's on the hot seat right now, and although I don't think this is moving the needle in terms of him staying as the coach of the Texas Longhorns, it wouldn't hurt. So give me Texas to move on, play their rival Texas A&M in the second round. Then we have LSU versus Mississippi State. Josh Hubbard, one of the best players in all the SEC, can get hot quick. I think he does in this one. Give me Mississippi State moving on to the second round. Then Oklahoma versus Georgia, two teams that are on the bubble right now. I'm going to be picking the Georgia Bulldogs for the main reason that they beat Florida a few weeks ago, which was one of the best wins in all of college basketball this year. I really like Asa Newell and the rest of that team, so give me the Georgia Bulldogs to move on and face Kentucky. Then our first matchup of the second round, we see Arkansas versus Ole Miss. I'm actually going to be picking the Razorbacks to move on. Coach Cal gets his team to the quarterfinals in his first season. Then we have Texas versus Texas A&M. Texas A&M just beat Auburn recently after a 4-game losing streak, so I'm going to be picking the Aggies to move on in this one and beat their rival in Texas. Then we see Missouri taking on Mississippi State. Missouri has been struggling as of late, actually on a 3-game losing streak currently, but I still like the Tigers. They actually get the win, so give me Missouri moving on. Then we see Kentucky taking on Georgia. Kentucky's suffering so many injuries this season, another one coming from Jackson Robinson, who's out for the season. I think that could hurt, but they've actually won their last 2 games. I feel like this team is playing extremely well despite all of the injuries, so I'm going to be picking Kentucky over Georgia in this one, but I think it'd be a close one. In our first matchup of the quarterfinals, we see Arkansas taking on Auburn. Coach Cal and the Razorbacks actually played extremely well last time they played Auburn on the road, so I don't think this is a gimme for Auburn. Also a team that's lost their past 2, but even after suffering those 2 losses, I still think they're one of the best teams in the country, so give me the Bruce Pearl and the Auburn Tigers to move on. Then we see Tennessee taking on Texas A&M. I think this would be a really good game. Tennessee, one of the best defenses in all of college basketball, and when that offense gets going, they're tough to beat. I think Tennessee is able to get past Texas A&M just due to Texas A&M's inconsistency on offense at times, so give me the Volunteers. Then we see Florida taking on Missouri. Florida getting a few big wins as of late, currently on a 3-game winning streak. I think that continues as they're one of the best teams in the SEC. So give me Florida moving on. Then we see Alabama versus Kentucky. I think this is where the injuries start to hurt the Wildcats a lot, especially when you have to play back-to-back days. So I like the Crimson Tide in this one. So in the semifinals of the SEC tournament, we see all the top 4 seeds advancing in my predictions. And when we see Auburn and Tennessee play, I think Auburn continues to advance as they've been dominant. The best team in the SEC this season. So give me the Tigers to advance to the championship game, where they'll be taking either Florida and Alabama. And this is a really tough game for me to pick, but I'm going to continue to trust the Florida Gators. They've been absolutely incredible this season. Todd Golden has this team playing extremely well, and I think Florida is going to get the win over Alabama in a close one. So in the championship game, we see Florida taking on Auburn. I think Florida gets Auburn again. I'm so high on this Florida team. They have so many weapons. Walter Clayton, Will Richard, Elijah Martin, Alex Condon, and more. Feels like whenever they have guys in foul trouble, they just have more that are able to come off the bench and play extremely well. So give me Florida as the champion of the SEC this year. Our last conference is the Big Ten, as their champion will be crowned just before Selection Sunday. And in our first matchup, we see Northwestern taking on Minnesota, and both teams have pretty similar resumes, 7-13 in the conference. Minnesota 15-16 on the season, Northwestern 16-15, but I'm going to be picking Minnesota as they just have had some better wins overall this season. So give me Minnesota to the next round. Then we see Iowa taking on Ohio State. Ohio State really needs a good showing in the Big Ten tournament just to solidify their spot in March Madness. So I'm going to be picking Jake Diebler and the Buckeyes to advance in this one. Then USC versus Rutgers, and this might be more just a pick for me as a fan, but I got to take Rutgers in this one. Really like to watch those freshmen play and hope that continues in the Big Ten tournament. So give me the Scarlet Knights to advance to the next round. Then in the second round, we see Indiana and Oregon as our 8 and 9 9 seeds facing off, and although I want to pick Indiana in this one, Oregon has been playing extremely well as of late, currently on a 7-game winning streak, which is tied for the longest in all of the Big Ten with Michigan State. They've been absolutely crushing it. Jackson Serlstad is a problem. Also, Nate Bill, a great big on that team. I'm going to be picking the Ducks to advance to the next round. Then we see Minnesota taking on Wisconsin. Wisconsin struggling a bit as of late, just lost their last regular season game, but I'm trusting the offense that John Tonji and the Badgers bring, so give me the Badgers moving on to the next round. Then we see Ohio State taking on Illinois. This could be a really close game, but Illinois playing well as of late, also on a 3-game winning streak. Also have Kasparis Yakashonas, which is one of the top prospects in the NBA draft this year. I think they just have a little too much talent compared to Ohio State, so I like the Fighting Illini and Brad Underwood to move on. And then in our last matchup of the second round, we see Rutgers taking on Purdue. And although I want to pick Rutgers, I'm going to pick the Purdue Boilermakers. Braden Smith, one of the best point guards in the entire country. Trey Kaufman-Renn, a stud big for the Boilermakers. And then I think Lawyer's going to shoot it well from 3, so it can be the Boilermakers to advance to the next round. So in the next one, we see Oregon versus Michigan State, the 2 hottest teams in the Big Ten right now. And I think it would be a close one, but I still have to stick with Michigan State. They have been absolutely incredible this season. Tom Izzo has them up to 7th in the AP poll. They were 17-3 in the Big Ten, 26-5 overall, and I don't see their fantastic season stopping here, so give me Michigan State to advance to the semifinals. Then in our next matchup, we see Wisconsin taking on UCLA. Both teams at 13-7 in the Big Ten, but UCLA had the tiebreaker between the two, but I'm actually going to be picking the Badgers with the small upset here. Again, like I mentioned, John Tonji, great player, averaging roughly 20 points per game. They also have Max Klesmit, Stephen Crowell, 2 amazing players on that Badgers team. Just think they have a little too much for UCLA in this one. Then we see Illinois taking on Maryland. Maryland, one of the best starting 5s in all of college basketball. Also one of the best freshmen in Derek Queen. I think he's extremely underrated. I think the Terrapins are able to advance past Illinois. Then in our last matchup of the quarterfinals, we see Purdue taking on Michigan. And Michigan has been struggling as of late, lost their last 3, and even their wins in their past 10 have all been very close games. I'm going to be picking Purdue to get the upset in this one and advance to the semifinals over the Wolverines. So in our semifinals, we see Michigan State versus Wisconsin and Maryland versus Purdue. In that Michigan State versus Wisconsin matchup, I gotta take Michigan State. Again, one of the hottest teams, not only in the Big Ten, but in the entire country. Jay Nakin's playing extremely well. You also have Jace Richardson, Cohen Carr, who is just a highlight waiting to happen. I love what Tom Izzo has done, and gotta trust Tom Izzo in March. So give me Sparty moving to the championship game, or they'll be taking on either Maryland or Purdue, and I think I still have to stick with the top seed in this one, Maryland Terrapins. Maryland Terrapins, honestly one of the surprises of this season, but have had a great year, 24-7 on the season, 14-6 in Big Ten play. I like Jacoby Gillespie out of the guard spot. As I mentioned, Derek Queen that they have there in the front court as well. Really like this team all around, so give me Maryland to move on to the championship. So in the finals, we see Michigan State taking on Maryland, our 2 top seeds, and I gotta give it to Tom Izzo and Sparty. It doesn't seem like anyone in the Big Ten is able to beat Michigan State right now, and I think that continues with Tom Izzo and the Michigan State Spartans becoming Big Ten champions and maybe making a push for one of those 1 seeds. Let me know in the comments what you think of the predictions, and who do you think is going to win each of these conference tournaments. Selection Sunday is just around the corner, so make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.